Chapter 9 in Levine's book on working with people focuses upon the development and use of skills and techniques in our work with clients. It isn't just enough to develop a theory, and it's certainly something that we need to have as a theory and an idea about how to approach clients and how to work with clients, but we also need to have some specific capacities in order to do so. And I want to tell you from the beginning, I think she identifies like 5 or 6 different skills and 17, 18 different techniques to use with persons, and this is just really the tip of the iceberg. But these are some of the basic kinds of skills and techniques that you might want to develop and know about as you go about your work with clients in the years ahead. Having developed this theory base about people, interactions, and modes of intervention, we next must consider the path to follow to attain the goal, that is, to reach the goal that we want to work on, and what tools we need to have in order to do that. Now, social workers make extensive use of themselves in this work, and I think what that means becomes more evident as this particular chapter goes along. But as an individual professional, we have to recognize what our own strengths are and where our weaknesses are. Well, okay, there was a bit of an interruption there for a telephone call, but if I remember correctly, where I left off, I was saying that social workers, we have our strengths and our weaknesses, and given that there are certain techniques that we're going to find that we're more adept at utilizing than others, and so among other things, one of the criteria, I suppose, that we ought to use in determining how to work with clients has to do with what kinds of techniques we can use that really we can be effective with. And so some of that speaks to what our strengths and our weaknesses are in terms of, well, our own humanity and our abilities to use certain approaches in dealing with other people. So we select these methods and techniques, and we develop our own individual styles and use the tools of the trade, as this slide says, in our own unique ways. And this really does truly turn our work into an art. And when my first social work degree, in fact my bachelor's degree at Michigan State way back when, was a BA. It wasn't a Bachelor of Science, it was a Bachelor of Arts. And I couldn't understand that for a period of time, but as I began to work with people, I realized that really it is an art to be able to utilize different techniques and to work with individuals. And so we can take some pride in that, I think. So we have to really know who we are, we have to be accepting of who we are, and then we can use our capacities to work with people. So know what your limits are, consider alternative ways of providing help at times if you can't do it yourself. But in any event, we're all going to develop our own unique set of methods, and as I say, as we go through these slides, the kinds of things you're going to see here is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what workers can use. Now, as far as basic skills are concerned, Levine identifies 6 different basic skills in providing social work services. The first is a term that you'll become more familiar with if you're not yet familiar with it, and that is differential diagnosis. And basically what this means is that when you're looking at a client situation and assessing it, you have to kind of determine what you develop a theory basically of what's going on. Diagnosis not only perhaps of the client per se, but really a diagnosis about the situation and how to go about that. And the differential part, of course, means that you're deciphering between what exactly it is that's happening. So workers have to be able to understand the uniqueness of the client and the situation, and then we adapt our techniques based upon this uniqueness. And always we have an assessment of the client's level of functioning as well in making this diagnosis. This is something else that has a big bearing, I believe, on the selection of technique that we use too, because we have to consider what the client can understand and can participate in. Timing is another basic skill. Some of that involves your own personal tempo, if you're kind of a high energy kind of person or not, but certainly your tempo is only one part of the bigger picture, and we have to be able to consider what the client's tempo is, and perhaps that's even more important. Once again, calling back to several weeks ago when we were talking a little bit about Father Michael Alexa's talk about the different kinds of things that impact our working relationship with Alaska Native clients. If you remember, tempo, I believe, is what he referred to it, which is the pace of life and the pace of interactions with other people, is something that's very, very important. And so know what the timing is the tempo of your client as well as your own, and as much as possible, work towards bring those together, I suppose. Timing also, I like the term that they use here, has to do with the tide in the affairs of men. That is, you have to wait for the right moment sometimes to introduce a certain technique or to provide a certain intervention. We call it a strategic moment, basically, and that intervention will have a much greater effect. And so timing also involves when to utilize certain skills and certain interventions, and sometimes we wait, sometimes we act a little more quickly than we might. Another skill that is very important for you to become familiar with is partialization. And this is the capacity of the worker to take what is an overwhelming problem to a client and breaking it down into manageable units, the things that can be tackled. And so when a client is, for instance, say very, very depressed and has trouble getting out of bed in the morning, you can look at this in terms of a medical issue and perhaps have a medical evaluation done to see if there are medical problems contributing to the depression. But if it is in response to certain things in life, identifying what those particular problems are and beginning to tackle those problems one by one, so that the client can experience some success in tackling those problems little by little, and not be so overwhelmed by them. So you're breaking things down into manageable units. Problems don't occur in isolation. Generally, there's only in one dimension, as it says, but there's usually problems have ripple effects and involve many other things that are going on in life. And so, in addition to breaking these things down into manageable units, you're also going to help your client to prioritize and what is most important to deal with. I would advance the notion here that one of the things you should do in partializing is also to help the client direct the client towards something, point the client towards something that will give the client an opportunity to experience some success. Don't tackle the biggest problems first. Don't tackle the most intractable problem, even if that seems to be the most important thing. If it's a life and death situation, that's a different matter. But if you have a choice, try to lead the client towards resolving some of the smaller issues first, because that gives the client some success and some hope for being able to also be successful with the larger problems that they confront. So you're setting priorities and always looking for that. Well, sometimes this I think the chapter suggests that sometimes when you know there's a key element, and when you deal with that key element, the other things kind of fall into place afterwards, and so sometimes you might look for that also. But partializing, again, breaking things down into something that's much more manageable. And it is something that when we become overwhelmed with life, when we become overwhelmed with particular trends in our life or whatever is going on around us, that is something that we lose the skill of being able to do. And so it's helpful to have somebody come in that can kind of help you break things down into manageable parts. Focus is another skill, and this is keeping your own focus on the problem and also finding ways to help the client concentrate his or her efforts on a situation that requires the work, and then retaining that focus until reaching a conclusion. That is something that may take a lot of extra effort and work on your part, because sometimes when things don't improve relatively quickly, sometimes clients will lose motivation, and so your goal is to really kind of keep them focused on what the objective is, and help them to continue to maintain their focus on it. Partnership. Establishing a partnership is another skill, a basic social work skill. And this is a partnership where really it's there's an understanding and acceptance of the differences in roles and tasks. It isn't so much about being similar to another person, that kind of partnership, but this is about a relationship where you complete each other, where you, when complementary with an E means complete. And so these roles and these tasks are the result of a relationship of complementarity, where the worker can perhaps fill in some of those spaces that the client is lacking in achieving certain goals. Every person in this partnership understands the role and the tasks of the other, and the ones of themselves as well. And so the worker's role really is based on the ability to supply what the client lacks. That's that complementarity piece, filling in what isn't there basically. And developing the partnership requires the maximum participation of the client in the process. And this is true through all of these things. We need the client involved and engaged in developing case plans, as we talked about, or your objectives and goals, as we've talked about, and in group work as well. But here on an individual level, let's say also, in establishing the partnership, the client needs to be very active as well. Finally, the last skill that she mentions is creating a structure. And this is something that really the worker has primary responsibility for, but again, the client should have some input and be able to share in this decision. What is the setting? Where are the boundaries that are most conducive to the work that needs to be done? And might also include how you go about solving this particular problem. It might include the problem-solving process that we had talked about some weeks ago, or some other approach to the issue. But you put your heads together and you decide on how you want to tackle this thing, where it's going to be done, when, and those kinds of things. Structure is something that can be very, very reassuring to clients when they're overwhelmed with problems they can't seem to contain. Now we begin to look at some of these techniques, and again, this is just sort of a dip into the water on these techniques. There's so many more aspects to each of these techniques to learn, and hopefully in the course of your social work intervention, you'll have an opportunity to develop skills in some of these areas. But just to give you an introduction to a rather large handful of some of these techniques, the first one is small talk, and this is kind of an interesting thing, because in some cultures, small talk really is kind of a waste of time. In other cultures, small talk is very, very important before you begin to address the problem. I think we touched on that in a previous week, I believe, where it's almost rude if you don't engage in some small talk first. But what small talk does really is it gives you an opportunity to get to know something about the other person, and them to get to know you a little bit and to get comfortable with you. You can kind of find some clues and maybe make a few judgments about the other person through this experience of small talk. But eventually, there's a point where the small talk has to end, and it's time to get down to the work at hand. But particularly as you're getting to know clients at first and those kinds of things, and in the beginning perhaps of when you sit down together at each meeting, small talk is something that really is, I think, is a very good skill to have. Ventilation is another technique. Again, a term that they use in the text that I really like is clearing out the underbrush. This is getting things up on the table more or less, opening up those feelings and attitudes that needs to be looked at and expressed. Because if there's a lot of pent up feelings, a lot of anger or negative attitudes or whatever about a particular situation, and those things aren't expressed, aren't identified, they're not put out there for everybody to see, it can really interfere in the process of problem solving, because it's very difficult to be rational and logical in the course of trying to, and motivated to solve a problem when there's a lot of unexpressed things going on inside. And so ventilation, again, there's a certain point where ventilation also begins to feed on itself, and expression of feelings can get out of hand. I once had a supervisor who insisted that the expression of anger only breeds more anger, and I have an issue with that, and I think this author would as well, because past a certain point, I think it certainly breeds more anger, but up to a certain point, it's really important to be able to work that stuff out of your system, more or less, so that you've, like it says, you cleared the underbrush and you can begin to deal with the cognitive aspects of the problem itself. Support is a technique, how to encourage, to uphold, to sustain the client through difficult times, and support in and of itself isn't enough. It's certainly an important skill, and it's useful to have, but you need to have more than a supportive approach for clients to be able to move forward in their lives. There are some people who believe that the therapeutic relationship, so to speak, that is developed between the worker and the client is in and of itself what's called a corrective emotional experience, and that's for a much deeper discussion about the impact of just having a positive relationship with another adult, or with an adult if it's a child you're working with. that experience in and of itself can fix a lot of different things in the client's life. But support kind of speaks to that a little bit, but it really isn't enough in and of itself. Another thing is, whatever support is provided needs to be genuine. It should never be based on falsehoods. It shouldn't be artificial, but it should be something that really is based on genuine empathy, genuine warmth, and good listening skills, I think, and but also being willing to take action when necessary, or to help a client to take action when necessary in order to tackle a problem. Reassurance. Assuring clients that the situations with which they are struggling have an attainable solution. Reassurance is another one of these things that I think we're told in working with clients to be very, very cautious about using, because rapid reassurance, superficial reassurance, everything's going to be okay, don't worry, those kinds of things really comes across as superficial and ungenuine, and I think it undermines a client's sense that that you understand, and so if it's not used properly, you really you communicate to the client that maybe you really don't understand just how serious this problem is, and maybe, well, the client at least is at a spot where he or she's not so convinced yet that everything's going to be okay, even if you say that it is. So if it's used properly, reassurance can be comforting and enabling. Otherwise, it can be kind of damaging, I think, to the process. But always be realistic, provide proper timing for your reassurance, and also be very knowing about what this reassurance involves, that both general and specific adaptations are always possible that can help a client resolve certain issues. Advocacy and social action, another technique. And this is oftentimes thought of on a broader scale, where we're really agitating for social change, and in part this point addresses that, but also looks at advocating for individual clients with systems that they're involved in. So if you have a client who is oppressed or who is being denied access to needed services or those kinds of things, you may advocate for that person's human or civil rights, for better housing. This, as this slide suggests, more educational opportunities, or being treated more fairly by an agency, let's say. In fact, our code of ethics does mandate that we advocate for clients, that we're prepared to advocate for clients whenever necessary, both on a micro and, I believe, a macro level. So that sometimes you're working on a larger scale, not necessarily even with a specific client, but perhaps a group of clients in mind, where you're agitating meaning stirring things up, not being irritating necessarily. Okay, but advocating to obtain resources or services that aren't attainable otherwise. You might be advocating to modify policies and procedures that have a negative impact upon your clients, or to promote legislation or policies that provide for services and resources that don't currently exist in your community. What technique for advocacy you use depends upon who you're advocating for and to, and what the focus is. One of the things I want to add to this is, I have known people who are very verbal in the field and very confrontive in their advocacy, and I would just say to you that advocacy is an art. It isn't something that you should be hitting people over the head with routinely. True, there are times in great movements, let's say, and in great times of stress when confrontation really is necessary, and can provoke a lot of resistance from the other side, but you still have to push forward with it. But by and large, your advocacy should be quieter than that. Hopefully it isn't withheld until things get so bad, that you really have to confront things vigorously. And always keep in mind that you're going to be a more effective advocate if you advocate with the other person's feeling in mind, or let's say if it's an organization you're challenging, that the leaders of the organization can hear you. And if you are challenging them in a way that threatens their sense of well-being and puts them on the defensive, they're not going to hear what you're saying. And so advocate, but advocate keeping in mind that your responsibility is also to communicate your advocacy in a way that the other person understands you. It's basic communication skills. I've just seen people advocate sometimes, and they put people off with their advocacy, and it's very ineffective. Along those lines, confrontation is another technique or skill that sometimes needs to be used. This doesn't mean necessarily sort of jackhammer confrontation where you just are drilling right through things and getting to the heart of things, and it doesn't matter what other people think or feel. But this means really kind of spelling it all out, laying the cards on the table, and looking at them as they exist in reality. It's not a hostile process. Doesn't have to be a hostile. Shouldn't be a hostile process. But it's a way of facing reality together. So, how much can a client take? That's something that should help you determine whether to use this technique and how you would use this technique and what amount of confrontation you're going to use, because you can scare people off and push people away from you if the confrontation is more than an individual can deal with. But sometimes when reality is overwhelming and you still have to broach a very difficult topic and confront certain issues with the client, you should be ready to provide support if needed, so that the client can deal with their own emotional reactions to the confrontation. Conflict, another technique. How to fight, and again, this is there's a whole series of techniques that involve disagreements, opposition, collision, those kinds of things, where basically conflict can be used sometimes to move a client along. But really, how to fight and how to fight fairly is a part of this that is a very essential knowledge, because expression of feelings is just the start. Once again, you have to come back to a rational consideration of the issue, and so the conflict has to be able to be resolved in a way that both or all parties or both parties stay involved and engaged in the process. This is something that's I really hesitate in a way to even have this in this list, but it's there in the text, and I would just say that this is something that you should really have a fair amount of skills to use before you make use of this with the client, because it can stir up other things as well. Now, the next technique, manipulation, that word has a very negative connotation. I remember dealing with this issue in parenting class, parenting classes where we had parents of kids who were very manipulative and managed to get things out of parents that the parents knew better than to give them. And so then what are we doing in parenting group but suggesting different approaches and timing and things like this to help them engage their child into cooperation and behaving properly and things. And the parents would say, well, we're manipulating our kids. I mean, this is why is this better than them manipulating us? Well, what is the objective here, and who, is this for good or for ill, is one of the first things you have to think about. When it's used as a tool for skillful management of a client, it's something that is acceptable and is very useful. But it needs to be, we need to be sure that it's not used in any destructive manner. And as long as it isn't, then it's a good tool. If it is for building positive things, then it's a positive skill to have. Manipulation can be used to provide constructive experiences, achieving the goal that you want to get, whatever it might be. But you need to be able to recognize, and this is also something in group work, to recognize destructive manipulation and what to do when you see that. For instance, in groups, sometimes subgrouping, where there's coalitions built and they kind of work against the leadership element in the group, and it's kind of destructive to the group process. It's a manipulation of the process, and it's important to know how to respond to that and to combat the manipulation that is used destructively. Again, that's something that is a skill that requires some training in order to be able to use effectively. Universalization is a technique that you'll find yourself using frequently with clients, and what it does is it emphasizes what is common among us in our human experiences, and how others that are similar to us utilize certain strengths when they were going through the very same thing, and this is how they responded to it, and this is the result they had. It's sort of like, I know other people who have experienced this, and gosh, it's difficult for everybody, but here's what somebody did. Or what do you think about this? I saw someone use this once. Another way of thinking about universalization is when somebody's struggling with some feelings, say they're feeling angry with an individual who might have let them down, or worried about someone, and someone expresses their feelings and you can kind of get a sense that they don't know whether they should own that feeling or not, and you say, well, of course you feel that way. Who wouldn't? Everybody would, not everybody, but lots of people would think that way. Another way you can use universalization is, for instance, when you trying to help clients feel okay about a social worker being involved in their lives, and you can in the course of introducing yourself to that person, say, I deal with lots of parents who have had troubles with kids, or I talk to lots of kids about things that have happened to them that hurt them, and so it's okay for you to tell me these things. This is universalizing things, that it takes the unique problem of the client, which they may feel very well is something no one else has ever experienced, or is so utterly personal that no one can possibly understand. It takes that experience and it kind of makes it something that's a much more common human experience. The slide says that it can share and compare knowledge of hose to deal with problems. That should be of those others who have, that have dealt with problems as well, and lend strengths to the client's others' experiences to the clients, the kinds of ways that others have resolved their issues. I like the use of universalization, and it is something that I think makes people feel okay about being in an interaction with you and feeling the way they feel. They don't feel so peculiar. Advice giving and counseling. I remember very, very fervently one of my instructors saying that he would take our diploma away if he ever caught us giving advice to clients. And the reason he said that is because advice is something that usually when it's given, it's pretty much rejected. Advice says, I'm the expert here and this is what you need to do to solve this problem. And if think about your own experiences and having people giving you advice, and probably one of the things, I know what happens to me sometimes is, if it was that simple, don't you think I would have done that already? And so advice is something that can be misused a lot, and if it's used too much, especially, or poorly timed, it really doesn't help things. And because the client realizes that you're not really personalizing what's going on, you're not really considering, or at least the client feels like you're not really considering their particular perspective on things, and so that's why it's rejected usually when it's given. But it can be a valid technique in certain situations, and some of this depends upon the client's ability to use your advice and counseling successfully. And there are certain situations where it's either required or is more likely to be successful. It's required in crisis situations a lot of times because you don't really have the time, say for instance with a suicidal client or something like that, to kind of use a lot of reflective thinking and active listening and if you have that kind of, if you're in a safe setting and you can do that, that's wonderful. But sometimes you have to get right down to being very directive with clients and in giving advice and crisis situations. So that may be one exception. Another exception is if you've got a strong relationship, a strong working relationship with the client, and you know that client respects you and has a lot of confidence in the things that you say, you might be able to provide some advice. I wouldn't do it all the time, but provide some advice that the client would actually follow because they have that much faith in you and your perspective. Some clients, and either through their life circumstances or through the conditioning of their culture, also come to depend on others. They come to you as an expert and they want to be told what to do. Again, I don't really recommend this as a general approach, but sometimes it can be useful. And maybe there isn't an alternative occasionally and you have to give advice. But again, do so sparingly. Use of programs and activities. In a relationship sometime, particularly when you have clients who are relatively nonverbal, children for instance, or clients who are very nervous and worried about you, you can do a lot of things to set them at ease by and create a good working environment by using nonverbal kinds of forms of expression. For instance, in a safe manner, so if this does require sometimes some training, sometimes not. For instance, with kids, it's playing board games and things like this is a good way to kind of break the ice, and actually you can learn a lot about your child client through the use of board games and kind of how they approach and deal with conflict and those kinds of things. With adults, you might have to take on other challenges. I've had times when I've sat down with a client and played a game of chess or something like that. But games are one thing. Sometimes just movement about taking a walk together, going down to the park and sitting and just kind of reflecting on what is around you. Those kinds of things can sometimes just kind of set people at ease and open things up. If you have particular training in art therapy or the use of drama and play therapy and things like that, this is other kinds of activities and programs that can be really helpful in your treatment relationship with the client. I had a instructor, a professor at Florida State. I think he's actually the dean of the school of social work now there, but his thing was using poetry and group work and having groups build poems together, basically to express what was going on in the group. And so there's all sorts of different kinds of things that can be used that are sort of indirect ways to approach problems when clients can't approach them directly. The next one is logical discussion, and this is something we wish we could do with all our clients all the time, is sit down and say, okay, let's break this down and think about what's really going on here, and have the client engage very cognitively and being able to work through and sort through everything that's going on at the moment. Wouldn't we all like to have that happen all of the time in our relationships? Maybe not such a great idea all of the time, because one of the things we have to be able to do is to account for and deal with feelings that are associated with problems as well. So we should never ignore those things. But when feelings are under control, when the underbrush has been cleared out, so to speak, and people are calm and able to think over things, then sometimes it's a good time to tap into the client's cognitive strengths if they have them, and most of your clients will have good cognitive strengths, and to utilize those in identifying the problem and thinking through some good concrete steps to resolve issues. So it really makes use of the ability of the client to think and reason and to really be able to step back and appraise reality. And that isn't something that all clients are going to be able to do, at certainly early in the treatment as well. Rewards and punishments, positive and negative reinforcement. We tend to be reluctant, and I think sometimes for good reason, to use this particular technique and work with our clients because of that it's not really our role, or because it's very easy to misuse rewards and punishments, and so this is something that can be used in treatment relationships, sometimes in working with difficult children perhaps, but maybe isn't something that you're going to use without being in a structured environment outside of an office, let's say. Whether we know it or not, we do use rewards and punishments though in our practices all the time, so that when we say, well, you did a really great job today, I'm really happy that you did this, or I really wish you could focus on on this instead of that, you're really providing negative and positive sanctions and reinforcements for what's going on with the client. And so keep that in mind, that you're rewarding and punishing your clients in very frequently in your interactions with them. So we really need to understand how the things that we say and do can modify behavior and reinforce certain kinds of things. Role rehearsal and demonstrations. This is used to enhance functioning, and things like role plays, for instance, to give your clients a chance to practice and rehearse difficult conversations or interactions with another person before they get there, so that if you have a client who's very anxious or isn't sure how they'll do in a certain interaction, you can actually provide a staged, certainly, opportunity to practice it with you, so that you become the other person and the client practices talking to you. I've also seen this done, by the way, with an empty chair, where you have your client talk to an empty chair as though the person were there. It's another way of rehearsing things as well. So, again, what is the client most comfortable with? What are you most comfortable with? What seems to work best? But in a role play, you actively participating, for one thing, you can also model and this is another way to kind of take a role play and kind of make it a little more interesting, and is for you to be the client basically, and the client to be the source of the problem, so to speak, and you address the client, in the way that the client might address. So you're sort of being a role model, more or less. And if the client can identify with you strongly enough in particular, that can be a very effective way to rehearse and demonstrate how to be more successful in interactions with others. The client is a lot of times in these, even though they're artificial settings, the client's going to experience some of the same feelings that they would experience in the actual event, and so you can kind of stop and check with the client about how they feel about certain things, and maybe give them tools in that process about how to deal with those feelings, so that it doesn't distract them from their objective. So if clients sometimes can't really kind of think things through that well and use their cognitive capacities, to decide how to approach things, sometimes practicing and actual role plays can be very useful for that. Something sometimes that I found can be a lot of fun with kids, teenagers, for instance. Creating a crisis is a technique for workers who know what they're doing, and again, this is something that I think I would caution you to be sure to be trained in this well. But you can produce movement in a stalemated situation, either through a direct action by the worker, or by refusing to step into a situation that would rescue the client from undesirable results. I have a friend who, for instance, has private practice, and from time to time, he may encounter some very difficult clients that, maybe he's working with a marital couple or whatever, and they're trying to resolve some issues, and they kind of have stalemated. They've reached a point where they don't want to stop coming to treatment because they want to work through these problems, but they're really not willing to make the changes they need to make in order to move forward, and so they're kind of stuck in a stalemate. When as the worker, sometimes if you are at a point where you're not sure what to do with people anymore, sometimes the best thing to do is to kind of say, let's just stop for a while. Let's not try to resolve this problem. Let's step away from this, take a month off, come back, think about this. Let's see if you want to approach this differently later on. And so in a way, you're creating a crisis because the clients are wanting to be here with you working on this, and you're saying, no, it's time to stop now. And instead of being pulled into the middle of this stalemate, you can sometimes break the stalemate by stepping out of the picture. Again, it depends on the situation and the circumstance and your level of skill, but it can be a very effective technique. Our ethics require that we make sure that we don't harm our clients ever, and to prevent unnecessary suffering, but also understand that rescuing clients to prevent them from experiencing negative consequences for their behavior really intrudes in their own learning, and really is going to inhibit their motivation to change undesirable behaviors. But always, in these kinds of situations, we don't do this because we're manipulators and because, it's fun to watch people struggle, and I certainly hope we never do any of these for that reason, and so we always practice these techniques that can be very powerful with respect for human dignity, understanding what the consequences may be of our behavior, being concerned for the outcomes of our actions or lack of actions, and being ready to deal with the results of those techniques when things pan out in the long run. Touch, boy, again, another one I'm a little reluctant to suggest as a technique. It is used by some individuals, and it's used to give comfort and support, to demonstrate acceptance, to reassure the frightened. But if it's used, it must be used very cautiously. That is in italics, and I can't stress this enough. It has to be very cautious, and it has to be in an informed manner, because touch means many different things to different people. Our code of ethics addresses touch also, and I believe it says that the worker should refrain from making physical contact with clients when such isn't needed for treatment purposes and isn't indicated. You have somebody sitting in front of you who is crying and their head's on the desk, let's say, it is kind of a natural, I think, urge for us to reach out and kind of touch them on the shoulders and pat them on the back or whatever it might be to kind of comfort them. But we don't know how that other person interprets that touch and what it means to them. And when you consider the variety of experiences, the breadth of the experiences that our clients have had, some of them as children have gone through things in their lives that we have never even thought about going through. We can't be sure always that they understand what we're trying to communicate to them. And so, and the other thing is ethnic differences as well, that some cultures, individuals from some cultures are much more comfortable with touch than others. And so we have to know about the client's culture. We have to know about their prior experience. If we use touch, it should be used for the client's need and not for the workers. I'm not telling you that you should never touch a client, but I am saying to you, you better be very, very careful if you do. And I think it's wise for us to find other ways to express comfort and support and solace to our clients whenever it's possible. The last technique that she identifies here is the use of visual and audio devices. Perhaps something that is, easy to be, is so much easier to use now because of the fact that we all carry little movie cameras in our pockets now with our smartphones. And so what used to be a big deal about setting up a camera with a tripod and all those kinds of things, now people are just hand holding cameras and taking movies of things. So it is a simpler thing to do. And the use of devices can be helpful in allowing clients to see themselves in situations sort of stepping outside of their own body more or less and looking in. And it can be helpful for them in trying to figure out how they might want to refine their approaches to certain problems. So in a sense, this is kind of maybe fits in with the role rehearsals that we were talking about a few techniques back, but this is where they may be able to actually see themselves or hear themselves if it's an audio recording. It's something also that is used very extensively in worker training and is something that I'm sure that you'll encounter throughout the course of your social work education as well. But in any event, whenever recording, whether it's visual, audio, whatever, we never do that without the client's full knowledge and full consent and informed consent, that they understand what is going to happen with this video, who will see it, what will happen to it after we're done using it, those kinds of things. The one-way mirror, or the one-way mirror is what it is, where sometimes I just want to say also that sometimes you may have a parent looking through a one-way mirror watching a therapy session, let's say with a child in a playroom or something like that. There's a lot of debate about this because if the child knows the parents there, it may change alter their what they say and what they do, so the parent may not be able to actually see what's going on. But I believe that we owe that child client the same respect we would afford an adult client, and the child should know that the parent or other people are on the other side of that window observing. And soon enough, they'll forget that anyway, but we should never do this without informing the client. So that's the issue of informed consent, and this is some things that I'm sure we'll be dealing with and you'll be finding throughout your education comes up. So there's a whole handful of a whole bag full of tricks and techniques for you to think about learning and developing your skills in, and it's all part of what we call that artistry of our work. There's just, and again, this is just kind of a tip of the iceberg. There's a limitless number of techniques out there to learn and use, and again, who you are as an individual, where your strengths are, what you can use comfortably, measured against or applied to the situation with the client, who the client is, and what will be most effective with the client. Those are the kinds of things that determine which skills and techniques you will use in the course of your work. So that's it for Chapter 9. Let me know if there's any questions left from this material. Otherwise, we'll talk again next week.